growing up, I grew up kind of lower middle class. My dad worked in construction. My mom didn't work when I was younger, and then ended up taking on a job, once my brother and I were off to school. I think, it was one of those things where we had as much money as we needed for, kind of day to day. And certainly my parents did everything they could to stretch every dollar. So I felt like I was just any other kid, like any other kid. We had tons of fun, and it was certainly a good, fun childhood growing up. I think, one of the things that my dad definitely taught me was that, you don't waste money. And I kind of got my work ethic from him. I mean, the thing that definitely pops into my brain is my dad's whole thing was you can't even call out from work sick unless you're in the hospital. If you're in the hospital, that's cool. But other than that, you're going to work today. So, yeah.
And I always love asking people, when let's say you're getting ready to go to college or just growing up, like, what did you think you wanted to be? Because obviously we'll get into what you ended up doing for a career and your whole journey, but like, where did you see yourself going? Maybe those like late years of high school going into college.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll even predate that for you, Justin. I think that I definitely remember when I was a little kid. I think I was 7 or 8 years old. I had an ant farm, and my parents got me a computer. I can't even believe this. Like in second grade, I went to this little tiny school, and we had a teacher that brought in a Commodore 64, and they taught us how to, do Turtle Basic, which I didn't know at the time, but that was the logo programming language. And I was just so into it. My parents ended up getting me a computer, a Commodore 64 for Christmas. And then we got the cassette drive, and it was just really cool. And from that time that I was a little kid, 7, 8 years old, I knew I wanted to be a scientist or, some sort of, didn't know computer science, but, obviously computers ended up being a big piece of what I did in my career.
And let's jump forward a little bit to college. What did you go to school for? It sounds like you're kind of this computer guy, you like computer science or computer engineering. Is that what you ended up choosing as your career? How did that shake out?
Yeah, great question. I think that when I first started out my freshman year, I was an electrical engineering major. I thought I wanted to do electrical engineering, and I took some computer science programming classes during that freshman year. And I realized, computer science is really what I want to do. So I kind of just switched gears and said, I'll do computer science. And when I was home from my freshman year, I was trying to get my old job back. I had worked in the hospital as a pharmacy technician during high school. And I went in to check the schedule. I was supposed to be working, and my name wasn't on the schedule. So I went to the director and I'm like, hey, what's going on? And they're like, yeah, we got a new boss, man. And they hired somebody else. So sorry, that job's not yours anymore. I was pretty dejected, and I knew wanted to make money over the summer. So as I went out to the parking lot, I just bumped into the IT director and said, hey, Nancy, I'd like to see if you have some sort of an opening, for an intern or something this year, because I thought I was going to be working in pharmacy and it's not going to work out. And she's like, yeah, come to my office tomorrow. We'll talk about it. Long story short, after that meeting, she designed a job for me, and I ended up working in my chosen career field, between my freshman and sophomore years in college, which was really cool.
And since we're going to go over your full kind of, arc and your path to retirement, when did you graduate? Like, what year was it? How old were you? And what was that first job like from a salary perspective?
Sure. So I think, to kind of continue on the arc that I said about, between my freshman and sophomore year, when I was going to school out of state. And I basically, at the end of the summer, went to my director and said, hey, Nancy, here's my official resignation letter. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Would love to come back to work next summer. And, but I'm going back to school. And she said, no. We don't want you to go back to school. We want to hire you full time, and we'll actually pay for you to go to a local school here so you can, work and get your school paid for while you're learning. So it ended up taking me 5 years to get my undergrad, because I was working full time for the last 4 of them. But I had like 3 different jobs in that time frame. I graduated with my computer science degree in '97. And I think at the time I was making about $36,000 a year. And when I graduated, within about 4 weeks or so, they actually bumped me up to $50,000 a year, because I think they knew I was a flight risk. which was true.
So are you just absolutely rolling in the dough? I mean, you're working as a full-time tech guy, basically, from your sophomore year on with very minimal expenses. I remember how I lived in college anyway. Did you just graduate and you had like $100K in the bank, or what did your personal finances look like during that time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I had more, bank statements or history or recollection from them. I certainly wasn't tracking my net worth back then. I definitely did start a 401k, or it was a 403b. I worked for a nonprofit. So I started a 403b when I was there, and I was putting some money in there, but I wasn't putting, a whole lot. I will say that one of the things that my grandmother taught me when I was very young was that once you establish yourself in life and kind of get, your baseline expenses covered, that you work really hard to make as much money as you can, and you're allowed to spend 10% of it, but then you have to take the other 90% and invest it in US savings bonds. So I didn't do exactly that, but that certainly had an influence in what I did going forward in terms of just kind of holding my baseline steady. And as I grew with my career, just socking more and more money away.
So it's around 1997. You're making like 50 grand. You've got the degree. You're saving a large majority of your money. Is there any point where, maybe you start to kind of take your eye off the ball, if you will? Like you start to make a little bit more money and you start to have that lifestyle creep, or did you stay pretty true to the kind of frugal roots?
That's a really good question. I had a bit of lifestyle creep. I mean, I did end up buying a new vehicle. It was a 1997 Ford Explorer. I kind of had that mindset like, hey, I deserve it, right? I have the money. I can pay for it. I certainly think that I wasn't quite as frugal as, say, my grandparents would have been. But I also wasn't going into, massive amounts of debt or anything like that. So yeah, if I had, I think in my mind, I always thought that I might retire early, but retire early was like way off. And what's retire early anyway? 60, 62. It was never anything like I'm going to retire super early. So it wasn't, probably didn't have my eye on the prize as much as I should have back then.
And did you have any mentors other than grandma back in 97? Were you, I guess, watching videos? Was videos even really a thing? Maybe you had like DVDs, like Tony Robbins, maybe some books. Like, did you have mentors, or maybe there was someone else in your life who was kind of teaching you the ropes and telling you to invest? Did you have anyone like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly my parents were diligent savers and investors, especially through through work, maxing out their 401ks and 403bs. So certainly my parents were a positive influence as far as that was concerned. I also think that I didn't have to have like instant gratification for everything. So I think I was good at kind of setting a baseline and not really going too crazy. And then when I started growing my career, I was actually able to bring up my spend, but still save a vast majority of what I was making.
And is there a point on your journey where you start to realize like maybe there is this like extraordinarily early, like not just 60, 62, like slightly early, but where you start to see a path towards, I'm making real progress here, and just kind of what was that moment like?
Well, really, I consider myself accidental FI. I didn't really realize where I was or where we were, me and my wife, because we were kind of on parallel accidental FI paths before we met. Until I heard Mr. Money Mustache on the Tim Ferriss podcast back in 1997. So we're rolling up on 7 years.
Wait, 1997? No.
I'm sorry. 2017. I don't know why I said that.
20 years later.
Yeah. So yeah, I didn't realize, how far I had gotten, and never heard of anything like the 4% rule until, I heard Mr. Money Mustache on Tim Ferriss, and it blew my mind.
And I guess up till that point, you probably didn't have the terminology that we have today. Can you backdate and like check what was your savings rate? Like, can you give us any numbers or percentages? You don't have to tell us the total net worth at the time in 2017, but like, just give us an idea of like how good you were doing, kind of going blind into this without having this whole FI community.
Yeah, so great question. I think that, I really worked diligently to, improve my career as time went on. So, that where I worked in the hospital during college and everything, they were smart to kind of bump me up to that $50,000 a year salary, because I actually stuck around for 2 more years. But I went out and did like this salary survey and said, hey, look, I'm significantly underpaid for where I am. And I remember walking into the CIO's office and basically presenting him all the information and saying, hey, look, I'm just asking for like the 20th percentile of what I should be getting paid. And that was $85,000 a year. So I was asking for, like a 60% increase or 35 grand more a year. And he's like, Bob, you are worth it, but I have to preserve the internal integrity in the organization. And I was just like, I didn't know what that meant. I'm like, what is this? This is like some kind of corporate speak, preserve the internal equity. And it turns out what he meant was, I have a lot of people that have a lot more experience and are older than you that don't make that much. So I can't pay that to you. And, 2 weeks later, he had my resignation and I had my 85 grand a year. And I think that was, once I realized that leaving, your current job, increasing your skills, leaving your current job and getting a new job was the best way to kind of move up. I was able to really accelerate that going forward. And yeah, so back to your, I think, initial question in 2017, where were we? I went to I think he referenced the simple math of early retirement in that podcast interview. So I went and read it and said, oh, okay, well, let's do a spreadsheet. So I went and did the spreadsheet and I was like, oh, wait a minute. So 4% of our portfolio, yeah, we can live on that. Like, we're already financially independent. So I showed that to my wife. Well, not my wife at the time, but hey, we can retire. And she's like, yeah, but I love my job. There's no need. Why would we want to retire? And I was like, okay, I guess we're not going to do that, and kind of put that on the back burner for a little while.
So in this 20-year period, kind of like from 97 to 2017, you mentioned the one increase there, the 50 to 85,000. Is there a way to give us just a few kind of spot checks with some timestamps on how that progression went, like how your salary continued to increase, just to give listeners an understanding of, how this came to be?
Sure. So I went out on my own after that 85K a year job. I thought that's what I wanted to do. The solution was to be an entrepreneur. And what I realized was I was just a self-employed person. I wasn't an entrepreneur. I was basically still trading time for dollars. So I made a decent amount of money doing my own thing for about 3.5 years. But then after the dot-com bubble burst, I really thought it was probably time to go back to work for somebody else. And I always wanted to work for a software company. So I found a software company to go to work for. And I worked in support and then moved my way into a professional services organization. And what professional services is, for those that don't know, is basically for large enterprise software companies. They basically, when they sell their solutions to an end customer or company, they actually bundle in services, which includes, professionals going on site to help install, integrate, and configure the software to basically get the desired customer result. And so I just had a knack for doing that. And I was like, well, this is really cool. And that significantly increased my income. I want to say my support job, I was probably making like 120,000 a year. And then that was in the, early 2000s. And then, dumb lucked into the professional services, I was probably making like 150 to 180 grand a year. And then what happened was, some of the sales guys started coming to me and saying, hey, we've got this meeting at Merrill Lynch, or we've got this meeting at Goldman Sachs, or we've got this meeting at Brown-Forman. Can you actually come with us and show the customer, like a dog and pony show, like how the software would work, and do a demo for them live, in a conference room? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like something I could do. So I started doing that, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so much better than doing professional services. Instead of going somewhere for 2 or 3 weeks and doing installs and being on site for 10 or 12 or 14 hours a day, now I'm going to a 2-hour meeting, and then I'm taking a customer out to a steak dinner. Like, this is way better. And then typically those positions include some sort of a commission base. So you have your base salary, and then your on-target earnings will include a commission. And so I started probably when I moved into pre-sales engineering or being a solutions architect, I was probably making in the high 100s, maybe low 200s. And, throughout the arc of I basically finished my career doing that type of work. Yeah, my average was probably about 250 to 275K a year, but my best year was a little bit over 500 grand, $504,000 I made one year where I really knocked the cover off the ball.
Wow. All right. This is really interesting. And I think we're going to be able to take a lot away for the audience. So, as people can tell, I think a big part of your story is your ability to increase your earning capacity. It sounds like you weren't scared to, ask for a raise, to kind of negotiate your worth. It sounds like you were also good at getting raises and hitting your on-target earnings and jumping ship when it made sense and going to another company. I know that happened a couple times. Then you stayed at the last company for quite a while. But what do you say to someone who's just, maybe they're kind of fumbling in their career? They're looking at their boss and their boss's boss. They're not making as much money as they want to be making, and they don't love their job. Do you have any tips for people, like whether that's negotiating, whether that's a certain way of reaching out? Maybe you had some system where maybe it wasn't LinkedIn back then, but like something that people can take into today's day and age, whether it's hitting up recruiters and having like a bunch of headhunters on speed dial. Just what can you tell some people that are not happy with where they're at income wise in their career?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Cody. I think one of the things that I read about this, but I can't remember who gave me this information. And this was early in my career. I read, figure out what metrics your boss is getting measured upon, and figure out how you can help your boss, hit all of his target metrics. And by doing that, all of a sudden you make yourself kind of the most valuable person to your boss. And then those salary negotiations that you have, which you prepare for by, pulling all of the salary survey information that you can and making sure that you're as diligent as possible in doing, your job to make everything you can to make your boss's life easier. That can help you really grow in the current organization. And then typically what you'll find is that one or two of those things that your boss has to do isn't necessarily in your job description, but it's something that you have an opportunity to learn and grow as an individual to provide more value to the company. And then typically that'll give you the leg up to, if you want to switch jobs, maybe you can actually have that same position that your boss has in the current organization in your new organization.
I know we've talked to a lot of people around, these type of jobs where having that sales component definitely gives you a lot more potential earning because, you can kind of sell as much as you can sell. Like you're not quite as limited as just a pure salary job. But also for some people, like it's a little scary not having, the guaranteed income. What was your ratio? Like what portion of your earnings was kind of locked in and what portion was generally variable if you just were like looking at on target earnings numbers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that, I've had a number of different scenarios. I would say the safest was probably like an 80-20 ratio where 80% was baked into my salary and I had like 20% upside for my OTE for sales. For anyone that kept the ratio, I think the lowest I had was maybe 50% for my base and then 50% for the OTE. But really, the best opportunity I ever had was the last company I worked for, where I talked to the founder of the company, and he's like, I actually took a shot of being a sales guy and an outside account executive 2 companies ago, and I just dumb lucked into calling, it was literally a wrong number, but it's a guy I used to work with. And so it's like, hey, how you doing, Bob? Bob, I'm doing great. How'd you do last year? And he was kind of a mentor to me at that previous company. So I told him everything that I had done. And his question to me was, do you realize now, like, holy cow, I finally found what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to be an outside, account executive. This is exactly what I've been meant to do. Or do you realize that you really like making the money that an account executive makes, but you really like being a solutions architect or a sales engineer? And I said, oh, it's absolutely the latter and not the former. And he's like, well, I've got a deal for you then. Come over here and you can do 100% commission if that's what you want to do. And so that's what I did. I did 100% commission for the last part of my career, which again, for a lot of people, people listening to this right now, that sounds pretty scary. But I didn't have the nomenclature at the time, but I had all the FU money basically sitting in the bank, knowing that, you know what, I could go multiple years, not even considering, you know, investment returns, but just multiple years with my cash cushion at the time. I was way under invested for a long period of time. So it was, what do I have to lose, right?
And was that 100% commission job? Was that the 500K plus year?
Yeah. Yep. When I made 504. Yep. That was
absolutely crushing it. Okay. Yeah. Let's pivot to the expense side of the equation. So I don't know if you have hard numbers dating back to 97, but maybe wherever you have numbers up until or back until, what were you spending? You could either tell us as a percentage of your total income, or if you have hard numbers, that would be even better. Just so people have an idea of like what it takes in terms of sacrifice to, you know, to achieve such fat fire without even knowing it in 2017 when you discovered Mr. Money Mustache.
Yeah. So in 2002, I purchased a townhouse. So that was up till that point, that was like my biggest purchase. And I want to say that my, you know, PITI on that, which I think I refied it over time, but I think I was paying around $1,500 or $1,600 a month on that. And after making the mistake of buying the brand new Ford Explorer, you know, and having paid that off, I never got into any other car loans again. So really all I had was, you know, my housing expense, and then, you know, food and clothes and all that kind of stuff. So my expenses were pretty low. And I think the biggest thing that I did was not, you know, from getting that townhouse, I didn't really ever inflate my lifestyle, right? So I kind of just, you know, kept the same car. You know, right now, the car that I have right now is 9 years old. I you know, I kind of keep things for a long time, and, you know, try not to increase my operating expenses much over time. So I would say in the beginning, when I very first started working in that support job, you know, my savings rate probably was only, say, you know, 20%, maybe something like that. And then, you know, as a solutions architect for the last company, Swish Data, where I worked, you know, especially in that year where I made 500 and something thousand dollars. I mean, it was, you know, I'm saving 80+% of my, you know, 85% of my income, because, you know, I'm not spending anymore just because I'm making more. So, yeah.
And especially because you found yourself basically FI without even knowing it. When you realized that, did you have any moments where you thought, man, I could have been living it up a little bit more? Do you have any like regrets that maybe you were grinding too hard, or do you feel like you were able to do everything you wanted to do and really don't regret anything?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you know, it's funny. I remember when I first met Cody at FinCon, I think that was in 2018. And I'm like, oh my God, if I had known about the financial independence space, you know, when I was your age, like where would I have been? No, I don't think I have any regrets. Would I have done some things differently? Absolutely. But, you know, the really good thing is, I think from the outside looking in, no one would have said like, you know, look how frugal, you know, Bob's living or anything like that. It's probably more to the point, they just didn't realize how much money I was making. So I could, you know, keep all the same friends that I had always had and not really let on, you know, how much money I was making. And I could live like everybody else, but still be, you know, saving a ton of money over time.
Yeah, because I mean, that 500K year, doing the math, you said an 85% savings rate or whatever, you're still living on like $75,000. So it's not like you're eating rice and beans, but you still have 400 and something thousand dollars that you're investing and saving. It's like you have such a large delta in between your income and your expenses. Yeah. I want to go back to that 2017 realization. I think it was your girlfriend at the time. You said you guys weren't married.
Yeah, and that I misspoke. We were married, and we were married, and I always get confused as to when we bought our house and when we got married. Yeah, we were married at that point. Yeah,
no matter. So your wife, you bring this to her. It's 2017. You guys realize you're fat fi. You're way past fi. 4% rule is long gone. She still wants to stay in her job. Yeah. How long does that persist? Like, what do those conversations look like? Because I know you're probably chomping at the bit. You're like, babe, you know, we are so far past this number. We could go travel to Europe. We could go on fishing trips. We could do all this stuff that we've wanted to do, and the things that we can only do in the weekend right now. But what do those next couple months or maybe next couple years look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I guess the good thing is, you know, Amy and I have always really did whatever we wanted to do anyway. So it's not as if we were living sacrificially, and we were certainly taking vacations. We had an unlimited vacation policy at my company where I worked. And actually, it's funny because my last year there, before I left, they actually came out and said, you know what, if you're going to take more than 6 weeks of vacation, you actually have to get the CEO's approval. And I was just laughing. I'm like, guys, just call it the Bob Haines rule. I mean, I know exactly what it is. I took 12 weeks off last year, so I know exactly why you're putting this rule into effect. But in any case, yeah, I think I honestly didn't really think much about it anymore. I was just like, okay, well, I kind of have this in my back pocket. It's all good. I think I was, kind of enjoying what I was doing, and everything was fine. I think probably about 6 months later or so, Amy's company, which she had worked at for like 18 years or something. I mean, it was her first job out of college, or first company out of college. And she had worked her way up all the way to a VP level, and she had worked in all over the organization. Well, her company was getting sold, and effectively she was being asked to kind of do mass layoffs, and kind of, basically they were trying to position themselves to be more streamlined. And, she didn't really like her job anymore when she had worked there for, almost 20 years and helped to build this organization. And then now she has to go to basically people that she's known for 10, 15 years and lay them off. So she came back to me one day and said, hey, remember that spreadsheet you were showing me, how maybe we could retire early? Yeah. Can you show that to me again? Sure. And at that point, I think it gave her the confidence to say, you know what, maybe I can take some time off. Maybe I can, not have to go right back into something else. So basically, it gave her the ability to go to her organization and say, hey, look, I'm willing to stay and kind of help you guys with the transition and do what needs to be done, but you're going to need to make it worth my while, and you're going to have to pay me out. And so effectively what she was able to do was orchestrate her own severance package. And her time ended up getting extended a couple of times, but her best year ever was actually 2018, the year that she left, because of all the deferred compensation and deferred bonuses and everything else that she ended up getting. So that was a nice way to kind of say goodbye for her to work. And then I kind of had the one more year syndrome after she left. So go figure.
So walk us through when you actually did pull the trigger and leave, and like, what was that like? Because I imagine someone who's making, upwards of sometimes $500,000, like that's got to be so hard to walk away from.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of the golden handcuffs, and I think that's one of the reasons why we were basically both targeting the same date to actually leave. But after hers got pushed back a couple of times, I think she ended up leaving in April, May timeframe of 2018. Well, my biggest bonus of the year would come in September. So, I'm looking at the calendar and I'm saying, 4 more months and I'm going to get the biggest bonus of the year. It doesn't really seem like I should leave right now. Well, that was typically true. But then what ended up happening was my biggest deal that I thought was closing didn't close, and it slipped. So I was like, so I got the, one more quarter. And finally just got to the point where, honestly, I hate to have to say this, but what pushed me over the edge was very early in 2019, we ended up going to 3 funerals. One was a coworker, one was an aunt of mine. And, I had 1,500 days, Carl Jensen, say to me one time that, Bob, everybody worries about running out of money, but nobody worries about running out of life. And I was just like, oh yeah, that's totally true. And now's the time. There's never the right time. So right before, I think, they started that rule where you had to get approval. I think I'd already taken 4 weeks off, and I had like 6 weeks of planned vacation. We were going to go to Alaska and we are going to do a bunch of stuff. So I just put myself into a corner where I had to go to my boss and say, hey, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is my wife and I are going to take a year off and travel the world. The bad news is I'm giving you a 30-day notice. And so.
And how did he take that?
Well, he was bright red, and he's like, well, that is really good news for you and Amy. And we'll hire you back anytime, whenever you want to come back.
Wow. Okay. And
which
this
was
is
nice.
2019?
20 was May. Yeah, April of 2019. Yep.
And as far as I know, you haven't looked back. You didn't take your boss's offer that you're welcome back anytime.
No, not yet. They have called me a few times over the years, and I've had some opportunities, but I'm having too much fun, doing other things right now. I'm not going to say I'll never go back to work, or at least do some consulting or something like that. But yeah, it's just not right now.
So are your income streams currently zero? Is there no side hustles, no consulting? Because I think that's really interesting. That's like a kind of a rare thing, and I definitely want to dive into like the drawdown strategy. But so yeah, you're shaking your head for those who are not watching the video. It's zero right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, it's been zero for the last 4 years. I will say that because I had the one more year syndrome after Amy left, we live at the beach, so she had a grand old time over the summer and fall. But then in the winter, January, February can get pretty cold here at the beach. So her previous boss had called her a bunch of times to do some consulting work, and I think she was actually on a girls' trip in the Dominican Republic or something, and finally relented. And she's like, "Okay, I'll meet with you when I get back from the girls' trip, and we'll see what's going on." So she ended up going back for like a 3-month consulting gig, working with her old boss. And I think for her, it was more of she felt like since she wasn't working anymore, maybe she was losing some of those skill sets and she wasn't able to do it anymore. And it was almost like just to prove to herself that she still had it and she could still do it. And within, a week or two of her going back to the consulting, she's like, yeah, this is like old hat. She knows exactly what to do. She was whipping the organization into shape and, hitting all the KPIs that they wanted her to do ahead of time. And so I think it was very edifying to her to basically just show that because she's not working, she's not losing her skill sets and she's still able to do it. And it was a nice chunk of money that she actually made in those 3 months. But since then, since I quit in May of 2019, effectively all we have is dividend income from our brokerage account. That's all.
And Cody just mentioned the, drawdown strategy. I think that's a big one, right? Like we're working. We get there. Now what? Like, how do we actually functionally pull this off? Was it something that you had a pretty detailed plan that you've been doing a lot of research into, or did you just kind of wing it and start to figure it out because you had a large cash cushion? Like, how did that work?
Yeah. So, I did do a ton of research. I mean, that's one of the things that I definitely, my wife has a sticker she got me for the back of my phone. It says, "Hold on, let me overthink this." So that's kind of the story of my life. So I did a ton of research on drawdown strategies, and we actually ended up in we lucked out. We're in a pretty good situation just from an asset location perspective. So at the end of the day, when I pulled the trigger and left in May of 2019, about half of our nest egg was in tax advantaged retirement accounts, and the other half was in cash and a taxable brokerage account. So we had way more than enough money to be able to fund us to age 59 and a half, where we could start taking out penalty free from our retirement accounts. And partly because I knew it was going to be painful for Amy and I both to actually sell anything, because, it's all been, build the nest egg, build the nest egg, build the nest egg. I knew it was going to be difficult to actually pull the trigger on, doing a sell of any VTSAX or VTI. It's just like, wait a minute, this is wrong. Like we're doing the wrong thing here.
Wrong button. Yeah.
So exactly. Like, what are we doing? So just as a framework, from a mental accounting perspective, I don't even present it to Amy and I as if we're drawing down. What we did was we put together an investor policy statement that says that effectively we have an asset allocation strategy of 80% US equities, VTI or VTSAX, 17% in bonds, VBTLX or BND, and then 3% in cash. And what I do is on a monthly basis, I look at those asset allocations and say, okay, do we need to make any adjustments here? And of course, the cash is getting spent down over time. So, from time to time, I have to do a little bit of, selling of something to plus up the cash cushion. But I make it like an asset allocation thing in my brain. even though it's really a drawdown thing, if that makes sense, just to make it easier.
Yeah. That makes total sense. I'm actually curious about how you were funding these accounts as you were working. So let's use the 500K year, for example. This year keeps coming up because it's an amazing year.
Yeah.
What does that look like in terms of contributions? Like, are you taking advantage of like a mega backdoor where you're plowing like, I don't know exactly what the limit was in that year, but like 50 something K into your 401k, and then you're, maxing out your IRA, and then maybe an HSA as well, and then the rest is going in a brokerage? Or like, how does the income kind of divvy up into the investments?
Yeah, I wish that I had done that, Cody. That was before I knew anything about the financial independence community. So backdoor Roth is not something that I heard until, 2017, after, I heard that Tim Ferriss podcast. So effectively, what ended up happening was I put, both Amy and I have been maxing out our 401ks for forever, probably the last 20 years that we worked. And all the extra money for me, I put a little bit in a taxable brokerage account and was kind of, buying some stocks here and there. But again, I didn't really know the whole simple path to wealth thing. And I didn't, know about VTSAX. So unfortunately, I had a ton just sitting in cash. I'd have to go back and look, but I want to say when I heard Mr. Money Mustache on Tim Ferriss, so February of 2017, I had over $500,000 in cash. So like in separate FDIC accounts so that, I had coverage. But yeah, I had just way too much money stacking in cash and not invested, which is, in hindsight, I mean, that's stupid. And to Justin's question earlier, I regret that. But hey, I mean, we're still where we are. You know what I mean? We'd be better off if all that was invested, but we're still doing okay now. Once I found the FI community and kind of went down the rabbit hole, and certainly once I read Simple Path to Wealth from J.L. Collins, I realized that it's time in the market, not timing the market. And it's not forget about buying and selling individual stocks, just put it all in and let it be there for forever. So we quickly rectified that, but that was, 2017, 2018, when I finally got out of all that cash cushion.
So I think it could be an interesting one for you then, because although you were investing via the 401k and you were on this great path for this 20-year career, you really hadn't been investing that long when we get to something like the COVID crash and where the stock market starts backpedaling, because the stock market had been doing great for, several years, but you were in cash. Now, all of a sudden, you convince yourself, you've learned, you're like, I'm getting into the stocks. And then a couple of years later, boom, we have this like 30% backpedal. What was that like mentally? And like, how were you able to weather that? And did you weather that?
Yeah. So to your point, Justin, I think one of the things that sticks out in Simple Path to Wealth that J.L. Collins says, hey, look, if you can't know that you're going to stick with this program through thick and thin, no matter what happens in the market, don't do what I'm saying, because it'll leave you bleeding by the side of the road. And I've had some conversations with him about that. Like, how do you know? Like, and this is prior to COVID. Like, how do you know in your bones that you're not going to sell? And he's like, you just got to commit to yourself. You don't really know until the moment, but you have to commit to yourself that you're just going to stick with your plan. And I think having that investor policy statement. I mean, Amy and I talk about this all the time. Like when the market reaches a new high, like today, like we've got a new high in VTI, at least for the last year. It's like, hey, do we put a little more money in cash right now? I know it says 3%, but and it's like, no, let's look back at our IPS. No, it says 3%. Like that's what we need to do, and we're going to stick with it. To your point, man, when that COVID crash hit, that hit me in the gut. I mean, we were looking at that. We do our numbers monthly, and I think we were down over $500,000 on month to month, was it February to March or March to whatever it was. And I was like, oh my God, like it felt like somebody kicked me. Right. I was like, holy cow. I will say we never thought about selling. At that point I was like, man, I kind of wish I was still working so I could put more money in the market right now, because equities are so cheap. But I'm actually glad it happened when it happened, because having already had that whole one more year syndrome thing happen for me, I knew that from a timing perspective, if I had just waited one more year, or if COVID was 2019, not 2020, there's no way I would have left my job in May after a 33% drawdown in equities. I wouldn't have had the courage to go ahead and do it. However, having had done it the prior year, it was like, do I want to go back to work? Absolutely not. So yeah, timing's everything. And honestly, I mean, I know I kind of explained how I told my boss about it, but that was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, was going in and telling my boss I was taking a year off to travel the world with my wife. I've been gainfully employed since I started working at 12 years old picking blueberries, and I've worked ever since then, So it was very difficult psychologically to go in and deliver that message. But then having the hindsight of what the last year had looked like, even once COVID hit and we took that big drawdown, it's like, yeah, I'm much happier, just living my day to day here with my wife than back at working in a corporate job.
I know you said you guys had built out that IPS where it's like the 80% equities, the 17% bonds, 3% cash. Do you guys have like a spending document, some kind of if the market is down by this much, or if our portfolio takes this kind of a hit, like, are you willing to adjust your spending, whether that's month to month or year to year? Like, let's say the market had a 40% crash. Are you going to then maybe travel less, go out to eat less? Like, are you going to adjust your spending with how the market is doing? Is that part of your policy, part of your statement?
It's not in the investor policy statement explicitly, although it's something that I've certainly thought about. And the way that we kind of think about our expenses is we kind of have our baseline expenses, and then we have our what we do for fun. And the what we do for fun, we're very fortunate in that the what we do for fun expense bucket is huge. It's massive. So we could very easily ratchet that back a significant amount and still not really affect our lifestyle. Like, do we really need to be? We've been like, this past year, we just got back from a 6.5-week trip to Europe, but that was our third European trip this year. So all told, we were in Europe about 10.5 weeks, I guess, this year. If the market takes a dive, do we maybe only go to Europe for a month instead of 10.5 weeks? You know what I mean?
Whoa, yeah, only a month.
Right. I mean, it's ridiculous even to think about. And we don't really track our spending that closely. And that's kind of in line with just how we got to being financially independent. We kind of just have, a feel for, what expenses should be, right? I don't think we live on one hand, we live extravagantly. On the other hand, we don't live that extravagantly, if that makes sense. So, we have, old paid off cars. My oldest car is, a 2005. So it's 18 years old, and it only has, 80,000 miles on it. And, I baby that. So, we really don't spend that extravagantly on our base level expenses. So there's plenty of room that we can cut back if and when we need to. But luckily, we've had a really good sequence of returns since I left. I mean, there's a number that I give to my wife every month when I go and do the finances, and that is how much we have more than when I retired. And I think we have an extra $850,000 since I retired, and that was 4.5 years ago. So it's like, I don't know how long I'll live. I hope I'll live into my 90s. My grandmother's 95. She still lives on her own. But I have 4 years less than when I left. And with an extra 850 grand, we'll probably figure out a way to be okay.
One thing you said earlier really resonated with me about kind of like timing is everything. Like, I may not have quit if I would have worked a little longer. COVID hits. And because like for me, I was kind of sitting there looking at, okay, I got about 6 months left to work, but I don't know that I really trusted myself that I was going to be able to stop. Like, I was going to be able to quit. And instead, the kind of decision was done for me via an acquisition. We get acquired, I get my severance, and it works out beautifully. And after that, like, I honestly felt so like kind of blessed that I was laid off, and I've had just super full days. Like, I've been so busy. I've had such a good time. I'm curious, like, when you retired, was there anything that like shocked you or surprised you? Was it everything you hoped it would be? Did you feel like you had something to retire to, that sort of thing? Or was it kind of like I don't know, I'm a little nervous about this, I'm antsy, or, like, what was the psychological kind of transition like?
Yeah, that's a really good insightful question. I think I mentioned that it was very psychologically difficult for me to actually pull the trigger and leave. We jumped right into a 6-week trip. So I think we were 3 weeks in Alaska. So I didn't have any time to really second guess the decision right away. Right. I'm like, I'm off, walking around on the top of glaciers and taking helicopter tours and, just having a fantastic time with family. We actually had 8 of us on that trip. And then when I got home, it was summer. We live at the beach. So, I'm out body surfing every day and riding my bike and just doing, it always amazes me, because some people will say like, oh, I don't know what I would do all day. I'm like, do you have fun on your weekends? Why wouldn't you just do more of what you do on the weekends? Or do you just sit around like you're so bored on the weekend, you can't wait to go back to work on Monday? I don't know. I've always had a ton of fun on the weekends, and no matter how much fun work was, the weekends were always more fun. So I will say the thing that, is probably the biggest, I don't want to say surprise, but certainly, I'm a victim to having the mindset that, oh yeah, as soon as I retire, well, I'll have all the time in the world and I'll be able to learn German and I'll get in the best shape of my life. And, the bottom line is you're still you, right? If you're not making the time to do the things that you want to do in your life when you're working, you got to look at what if something's really a priority, if you're saying it's a priority, because, that's one of the things to look at myself in the mirror all the time. Obviously, I'm not in the best shape of my life. Again, I aspire to do that. And, I've struggled with my weight my whole life. But that's part of probably the magical thinking of like, you're going to retire and your life is just going to be perfect. That's not the case. You're still you still got to work on yourself. And, the only person that can really give you what you want to have is yourself. And honestly, that's one of my biggest regrets. You asked about regrets earlier. One of the biggest regrets that I have, the last 2 years of working, I was super burnt out and I didn't leverage my FU money at all. I should have gone to my boss and said, hey, you know what? You have me doing like all of this. And, I'm really good at just doing this. So instead of doing all this, I'm going to do this. You can hire people to do all this, or nobody does it, or I don't really care, but I'm going to do what I'm really good at and what makes the company the most money. I would have been way happier and less burnt out, probably for the last 2 years of my career. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, Justin. I feel like I went off on a tangent there.
Oh, no, it's all good.
That was a good tangent. I think that was a fantastic lesson because I think it's so true. If you're not prioritizing the things now, like the working out or the learning an instrument or learning a language, you're not going to do it in retirement. You're just going to kind of fill it with more of the same stuff that you're already doing, whether that's Netflix or maybe it's some kind of a sport or whatever you're doing on the weekends. Like you're not just randomly going to start dedicating 4 hours a day to learning German if you're not even spending 30 minutes a day learning German while you're working. So right. I think that's a fantastic lesson. But as we bring this thing to a close, Bob, this has been a real treat, by the way, because I've known you for 5, almost 6 years at this point. I know like your general story, but it was a lot of fun kind of getting to peel back the curtain and learn a lot more about your childhood and like your career progression. For those who find your stories interesting as I do and want to learn more about you and what you got going on, where do you want to direct people? Like if people want to get in contact with you or just follow along, where do you want us to send people?
Sure. I'm at RJ Haines, RJHAINES on Instagram and on Twitter. You can also find me, Bob Haines, on Facebook.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you for giving us, a much more relatable story than maybe sometimes we can bring, and also just a true example of that standard. Like, hey, you can just work, put your money in these investment accounts, let them build up, and then live off of it. You don't have to go out and create some, crazy new business. You don't have to invest in Bitcoin. You don't have to come out with some random strategy. Like you can just do it the good old fashioned way and still do it very fast. So thank you for coming on the show and sharing your story.
Thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it. This was fun.